My husband of 31 years looked at me across the kitchen table one Tuesday evening, set down his fork like he was ending a business meeting, and said, "Honestly, Patrice, without me you wouldn't even know how to pay a utility bill." Our son-in-law Warren sat right there at the same table. My daughter Annette studied the tablecloth like it suddenly contained the answers to questions she'd never asked. And my husband, Theodore Harmon, laughed after he said it. Not a cruel laugh exactly. Something worse. The kind of laugh that means it's obvious. I smiled. That's what I always did. I smiled and passed the bread rolls. People think marriages collapse in dramatic moments. Screaming matches, slammed doors. Affairs discovered in the worst possible way. But 31 years with Theodore taught me that the real destruction happens quietly. In dinner tables. In passed bread rolls. In the careful, practiced art of swallowing yourself whole so someone else can feel full. When I met Theodore Harmon, I was 29 years old and teaching 3rd grade at Elmwood Elementary in Greenville, South Carolina. He was 34, already working in commercial real estate. Already confident in the particular way men become when the world has told them yes enough times. He brought coffee to my classroom one morning. Because a mutual friend mentioned I stayed late on Fridays to decorate bulletin boards. He remembered, I liked it with oat milk before oat milk was something people talked about. I thought that meant he saw me. We married 18 months later. For a while, things felt like the life I'd imagined. A small house on Briarwood Lane with a front porch we actually used. Weekend drives to the mountains. Theodore reading beside me on Sunday mornings without needing to fill every quiet space with noise. Then Annette was born, and everything shifted in ways so gradual I kept explaining them away. Theodore's job is expanded. Mine was supposed to be temporary. Just until Annette was old enough for kindergarten. Just until the new real estate firm found its footing. Just for now. The temporary stretched across years until it became permanent without anyone declaring it so. I stopped teaching. I started managing everything else instead. The school schedules, the grocery lists, the birthday cards for Theodore's clients' wives, the dinner parties where I cooked for 8 people. And Theodore accepted compliments as though the roast had assembled itself. He never said thank you. Not exactly. He'd say things like, "Patrice keeps things running" to guests, the way you'd describe a reliable appliance. By the time Annette married Warren Fletcher, I had been out of the classroom for nearly 2 decades. Theodore had become genuinely successful by then. A larger firm, a newer house with a kitchen I designed and a garden I maintained. He drove a car I would have needed to work 3 years to afford on a teacher's salary. People told me I was lucky. I heard that word so many times, so many years it started to sound like a warning. The small humiliations were the kind that leave no bruises. Theodore questioning why I needed a new winter coat when the old one was perfectly functional. Theodore explaining to Annette's friends' parents how he had built our financial security as though I had spent 3 decades as a pleasant decoration in the background of his real life. Theodore using the word allowance once, just once, when talking about the household account I managed to the penny. I told myself it wasn't meanness. I told myself he was under pressure. I told myself he loved me in the particular language of men, who were never taught tenderness was available to them. By the time I turned 62, I had spent so many years telling myself these things that they had worn grooves in my thinking like water on stone. Then came the Thursday I found the folder. Theodore traveled frequently for work. 3, sometimes 4 days a week. That particular Thursday, I was reorganizing his home office because the cleaning service deranged things the week before, and he'd complained twice that he couldn't find documents. I was trying to be helpful. That is the detail I return to sometimes. I was trying to be helpful. The folder was wedged behind a filing cabinet, the kind of place things slide when drawers get overfull. I almost left it there. Something made me pick it up. Inside were account statements, accounts I had never seen. Accounts with Theodore's name only on the letterhead and a post office box address downtown that I didn't recognize. The balances made my hands go cold. Collectively, just in the statements visible from the top of the stack, I was looking at over $400,000. I stood in his office for what felt like a very long time. We had always, I believed, shared our finances. I paid the household bills. He managed the investments. That had been our arrangement since we married, and I'd never questioned it. because trusting him had simply become a habit so old I'd stopped noticing it. I placed the folder exactly where I found it. Then I walked to the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea I didn't drink. I didn't confront Theodore, not right away. I had learned, across 31 years, that confrontation without preparation simply gave a man like Theodore the advantage of controlling the explanation. So instead, I waited. I paid attention differently. I noticed the phone calls he took on the back porch. I noticed the way he angled his laptop screen. I noticed that the investment statements he used to leave on the kitchen counter had quietly disappeared over the past few years. Once you start really looking at a person, you see things you previously chose not to. 2 weeks after I found the folder, Theodore and I attended a retirement dinner for one of his colleagues. Annette and Warren were there, several of Theodore's business partners and their wives. At some point between the salad course and the entree, one of the wives asked me if I'd ever thought about going back to work. Theodore answered before I could open my mouth. "Patrice hasn't worked in 20 years, he said, smiling pleasantly. "I'm not sure the classroom would survive the shock." Everyone laughed, politely. I looked at my salad fork. On the drive home, Theodore seemed satisfied in the way he always did after social gatherings where he felt he'd performed well. He talked about his colleague's pension package. He talked about a deal closing the following week. He did not mention what he'd said at the table. He never mentioned things like that because to him they weren't things. They were just how the world was arranged. That night, lying awake listening to him sleep, I thought about my students. I used to know every child's name within the first week of school. I used to make up songs to help them remember multiplication tables. I had a second grader once, a little boy named Marcus who arrived crying every Monday morning because weekends were hard at home. I made him the classroom helper on Mondays specifically so he had something to look forward to. His mother sent me a card years later saying he'd become a teacher himself. I hadn't thought about Marcus in years. I hadn't thought about any of it in years. Theodore had slowly become so large in my daily life that everything I had been before him had compressed into something I rarely accessed. It was that realization, not the hidden accounts, that made something in me go absolutely still. The following Monday, while Theodore was in Charlotte for meetings, I drove to an attorney's office on the east side of Greenville. I had found her name through careful searching, not asking friends who might mention it. Her name was Helen Voss, and her practice focused on family law and financial disputes in long marriages. Sitting in her waiting room, I felt profoundly foolish. I was 62 years old. I had a college degree I hadn't used in 2 decades. No independent income, and I was about to tell a stranger. I thought my husband had been hiding money from me for years. Helen Voss was 60 herself, with reading glasses she wore pushed up on her head like she'd just been interrupted. She listened to everything I said without taking notes until I mentioned the accounts. Then she picked up a pen. "Do you have access to your joint tax returns?" she asked. "I sign them," I said. "I don't review them." She looked at me in a particular way. Not judgment, something more like recognition. "Patrice," she said carefully. "Staying home and managing a household for 3 decades is not a financial liability in a marriage dissolution. Courts understand contribution." I stared at her. I had not allowed myself to think the word dissolution until that moment. She gave me a list of documents to gather quietly. Tax filings, property records, retirement account information, insurance policies. "Don't ask him directly," she said. "Photograph what you can. Keep records somewhere he won't access." The drive home felt like driving a different road than the one I'd taken to get there. Over the following 3 weeks, I became someone Theodore would not have recognized. Methodical. Focused. Unafraid of his home office in a way I had been, I now realized, for years. I photographed documents before he woke. I noted account numbers. I found records of property Theodore had sold. A commercial lot we had jointly purchased from an inheritance years ago, with proceeds that had apparently gone somewhere I had never seen. My signature appeared on the sale documents. I did not remember signing them. When I brought that specific document to Helen Voss, she set down her coffee cup very deliberately. "This is a certified signature?" she asked. "It says so. Did you sign this, Patrice?" I looked at it for a long time. I thought about the times Theodore had slid papers toward me at the kitchen table, already talking about something else, already expecting me to sign without reading because he had explained it was just paperwork, just something routine, just something that needed handling. I don't know, I said honestly. Then we need a handwriting analysis, she said. I drove home in a kind of suspended quiet. The dogwood trees on our street were blooming. I had planted 3 of them myself, 20 years ago, not yet understanding that the same hands that put things into the ground were slowly disappearing from the record of her own life. The dinner that broke the remaining illusion happened the weekend before Annette's birthday. She and Warren came to the house. I had cooked for most of the afternoon: lamb chops, roasted root vegetables, a lemon tart from a recipe I'd had since before I was married. Annette complimented the tart. Warren talked about a project at his firm. Theodore poured himself a second glass of wine and said expansively, to no one in particular, "Annette gets her cooking from her mother at least. It's the one thing she can do that doesn't require my backing. The one thing." Annette looked at the tablecloth. Warren cleared his throat. I kept my face very still. "Dad!" Annette said quietly. Theodore waved his hand. "I'm teasing. Patrice knows I'm teasing." He looked at me, and I realized something that had been true for years without my fully understanding it. Theodore did not look at me to check if I was okay. He looked at me to confirm I would perform being okay. Those are completely different things. "Of course," I said. And then I changed the subject to something easier. That night, after they left, I stood at the kitchen sink, doing dishes by hand, even though the dishwasher was right there. Because sometimes you need something to do with your hands while your mind works through things too large for ordinary furniture. Theodore was in the living room watching news, the same routine we had followed for years. I thought about what I had been before this house, before Annette, before Theodore's schedule became the clock my days ran by. I had wanted to be a writer once, before teaching. I had kept journals from the time I was 12 years old. Somewhere in this house there were boxes of them. I hadn't opened any in at least 15 years. Where had that woman gone? Not dramatically, not in any single moment I could point to. She had simply been asked to step back so often, across so many ordinary days, that eventually stepping back became her permanent position. I dried my hands. I walked to the back bedroom closet where we stored boxes. I found the journals in the 3rd box I opened. I sat on the closet floor and read my own handwriting from 1987, and it was like finding a letter from someone I had loved and lost without ever attending a funeral. On the inside back cover of one journal, my mother had tucked a note. She had passed away 6 years earlier. A long illness that Theodore had helped manage paperwork for. Paperwork I had not read carefully because I trusted him. Mom's note was short. Her handwriting always went slightly uphill on unlined paper. "Patrice, when things get heavy, remember that the women in our family are not built to disappear. We are built to outlast. I love you more than you know." I sat on the closet floor for a long time. Then, in the back of the same box, underneath the journals, I found a bank envelope from a financial institution I didn't recognize, addressed to me, at a previous address, one I hadn't lived at since before I married. Inside was a statement for a small savings account my grandmother had established for me when I was born, a tradition she'd kept for all her grandchildren. I had completely forgotten it existed. The account had been earning modest interest for 40 years for's. The balance was just over $38,000. I sat very still with that statement in my hands. My grandmother's name was on the original account setup documentation. She had been a school teacher for 42 years and had never once asked anyone's permission to know her own worth. Theodore had helped organize my mother's affairs when she was ill. He had access to old address information, whether he had known about this account and said nothing. I found I couldn't determine which was worse, that he knew and hidden it, or that he had simply never considered it worth mentioning because it was mine. The following Saturday morning, I drove across town to a garden center where a woman I had been loosely friendly with decades ago now worked as the owner. Her name was Josephine Carr, and we had taught at Elmwood Elementary Ray together for 2 years before I left, and she eventually left too, for entirely different reasons. We had lost touch the slow way people do when life pulls in different directions, and no one means for it to happen. I walked into the greenhouse section, and she was deadheading marigolds and didn't look up immediately. When she did, she went very still for a moment. "Patrice," she said. "My God!" I almost cried right there between the geranium flats. We sat in the small office attached to the greenhouse, with mugs of coffee that tasted like it had been sitting since morning. Josephine listened to everything. She had a particular quality I had forgotten about her. She never filled silences with her own opinions while you were still thinking inside yours. When I finished, she looked at me for a moment. "Do you know what I remember about you from Elmwood?" she said. I shook my head. "You used to rewrite your lesson plans every year from scratch, not tweak them, completely rewrite. You said every class of children was different and deserved a fresh start." I had forgotten that. "You were never someone who accepted the version of things that was handed to you," Josephine said. "You always made your own." I looked away because I was not prepared for how much that cost to hear. Josephine leaned forward. "I lost my business partner 5 years ago. She took half the inventory and all of the vendor contacts, and I thought it was finished." She gestured around the greenhouse. It wasn't. She stood and walked me through to the main growing area. Spring seedlings in neat rows. The smell of soil and something green and alive that gets inside you if you let it. "I need someone who understands how to talk to people," she said. "Someone who can run the educational workshops we keep promising to start. Garden education for schools, seniors, community groups." She paused. "Someone like a teacher." I stared at her. "Josephine, I haven't worked in." "Did you forget how to grow things?" she asked. I looked at the seedlings. I had been tending the garden at Briarwood Lane for 20 years. I knew every plant in it by Latin name and temperament. I knew which ones needed shade, and which ones needed more water than they admitted, and which ones looked dead in February but weren't. Theodore had never once commented on the garden except to note when something wasn't blooming. "Let me think about it," I said. She handed me a flat of seedlings on my way out. "Tomatoes." "Practice," she said. The divorce process began 6 weeks later, after Helen Voss's handwriting specialist confirmed what I had already understood in my body before I could say it plainly. Several signatures on property documents were not mine. Helen filed the appropriate motions. Theodore's attorney called Helen immediately. The comfortable certainty in Theodore's voice when he called me that evening was the sound of a man who had spent 31 years being right about everything and did not yet understand this particular situation was different. "Patrice, this is unnecessary and embarrassing," he said. "Yes," I agreed. "It is." He paused. Theodore didn't like it when I agreed without argument. Agreement that led nowhere gave him nothing to push against. "You can't honestly believe you'd be better off without this marriage." "I don't know yet," I said. "But I think I'd like to find out." I moved into a rented house on the south side of Greenville in early March. It was a small place with a yard that had clearly been neglected for several seasons. Overgrown beds, a cracked path, a dogwood near the fence that looked like it hadn't been pruned in years. The first night alone, I ate toast, standing at the kitchen counter, because I hadn't unpacked the table yet, and I listened to the neighborhood sounds. A dog somewhere, a car passing, someone's wind chimes, and thought about how strange it was that silence and peace could feel like the same thing, or like completely opposite things depending on what you'd been living inside. That night I cried. Long, thorough crying that I'd been postponing for months, for the years, for the woman in the journals, for the specific grief of realizing you loved someone for a very long time before you understood what they thought they were loving back. In the morning, I planted the tomatoes in the neglected yard. Then I called Josephine. The first workshop I led was 6 weeks later. 8 women, all over 50, gathered in the back greenhouse on a Saturday morning to learn basic container gardening. I hadn't stood at the front of a room with something to teach in 22 years. My hands shook while I arranged the soil bags and the small pots on the potting bench. One of the women, who introduced herself as Ruth, said, "Are you the instructor? You look a little pale." "First day back," I said. Ruth nodded like that, explained everything, because it did. 2 hours later, we had planted 8 containers. 2 of the women were exchanging phone numbers. One woman told me she'd never grown anything in her life and had started crying when the first seed went into the soil, and we had all given her a moment, because certain things don't require explanation. Afterward, Josephine handed me an envelope. My first payment for instructional work in over 2 decades. I sat in my car in the garden center parking lot and held it without opening it for a long time. Then I opened it. It was not a large amount. It was entirely mine. Something unlocked in my chest that I hadn't realized was locked. The workshops grew. Word moved through community groups and senior centers, and eventually a local elementary school reached out about a spring gardening program. I stood in front of 23 fourth graders, with my hands in the soil, and felt something return to me that I had set down so long ago I'd stopped feeling its absence. Josephine gave me more hours. I started writing a monthly newsletter about seasonal planting for the garden center's mailing list. Small things. Accumulating. Theodore texted occasionally during those months. The messages followed a pattern I recognized. First concern. Are you really okay on your own? Then logic. This is going to cost you far more than staying would have. Then, as Helen's investigation progressed and the financial documents became harder to manage. Can we please talk like adults? I answered some of them. Briefly, I stopped answering the ones that wanted me to feel small. The moment Theodore came to Josephine's garden center happened on a Saturday in October. 3 months after the legal proceedings had produced enough documented evidence of financial misconduct that his attorney had reportedly become significantly less comfortable in their meetings. I was running the fall workshop that morning, preparing perennials for winter, when I looked up and saw Theodore standing near the front entrance in his good coat, the charcoal one he wore to meetings. He looked older than I remembered. He also looked like a man who had driven somewhere he hadn't quite planned a reason to be. Josephine appeared at my shoulder almost immediately. Do you want me to handle it? She asked quietly. No, I said. I walked to where he stood. Several of the workshop participants glanced over with the careful attention people give to situations they recognize without needing explanation. Theodore, I just wanted to see for myself, he said, looking around the greenhouse. His voice had something in it I wasn't used to. It took me a moment to identify it. He was uncertain. See what? He gestured vaguely. This you? He paused. I heard about the school program. Annette must have told him. Annette and I had been talking more since I moved out. Carefully at first, then more honestly. She had told me, in the way adult children sometimes confess things they should have said years earlier, that she had watched her father speak to me the way he did for her entire life, and told herself it wasn't her place to say anything. She cried when she said it. I told her I understood. Because I did. Theodore looked at the workshop table. The participants had turned back to their work with the particular diplomacy of strangers who understand they are in the presence of something private. You look different, he said. I am different. He was quiet for a moment. The attorneys are saying. He stopped, restarted. There are going to be consequences I didn't anticipate. Yes, I said. Patrice. He looked directly at me, and for a moment I saw the man who had brought coffee to my classroom all those years ago and remembered the oat milk. I thought I was building security. For us. For after. You built it in your name, I said. He didn't answer that. You signed documents without my knowledge, I continued, keeping my voice low and even. You sold property without telling me. For 31 years, you made every financial decision while telling me I wouldn't understand them. I was protecting. You were controlling, I said. There's a difference. You knew the difference. The silence between us carried 31 years of dinner tables and passed bread rolls and swallowed words. Theodore looked at the floor briefly. When he looked back up, his expression had shifted into something I had rarely seen on his face. Something undefended. I didn't expect you to be like this, he said quietly. Like what? He searched for the word. Sure of yourself. I looked at him carefully. This man who had stood in our kitchen and told me I couldn't manage a utility bill without him, who had laughed at his own joke and waited for me to perform agreement. I was always sure of myself, I said. You just needed me not to be. He stood there for another moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, in the way of someone receiving information they already suspected but hadn't been ready to hold. He left without another word. I stood watching him walk to his car. Josephine appeared beside me again. You okay? She said. Yes, I said. And I was, not triumphant, not healed exactly, but present in my own life in a way I hadn't been in years. We went back to the workshop. Ruth was attempting to untangle the root ball of a stubborn ornamental grass and swearing creatively under her breath. I walked over and helped her, and she said, These things don't give up without a fight. And I said, No, they don't. And she laughed, and so did I. The settlement finalized 8 months after I filed. Helen Voss walked me through each component. With the particular calm of a woman who has guided other women through the specific grief of discovering a marriage was not the agreement they thought they'd made. A substantial portion of the hidden assets were reclassified as marital property. The forged signatures resulted in a separate legal proceeding I chose not to detail publicly. Theodore avoided criminal charges through a financial agreement his attorneys negotiated. He sold the house on Briarwood Lane. I did not need the house. I had a neglected yard that was becoming a garden. A year and a half after I moved into the small rental with the cracked path, Josephine and I opened a second location for Carr's Garden Center on the north side of Greenville. My name was on the business registration alongside hers. A partnership. Genuinely equal. The morning we unlocked the doors for the first time, I stood in the front room where the checkout counter was, looking at a wall of seed packets organized by growing season, and thought about my grandmother's savings account that had been waiting for me without my knowledge for 40 years. My grandmother had been a teacher for 42 years and had never asked anyone's permission to know her own worth. I think about her sometimes when I'm leading a workshop or writing the newsletter, or dealing with a vendor negotiation I would have handed off to Theodore without a second thought 2 years ago. I think about what she built quietly, without fanfare, in the particular margins of a life that didn't always give women the main stage. I think she would have liked the garden. Annette came by the new location on opening weekend with Warren, who was carrying their daughter, my granddaughter, born 4 months before the second location opened, in a carrier on his chest. Annette looked around the space and pressed her hand briefly against her mouth. "Mom," she said. "I know," I said. She hugged me for a long time. Over her shoulder I could see the seedling tables and the workshop chairs arranged in a semicircle, and the handwritten sign in the window that Josephine had made, reading, "We grow things here." Warren, who had been awkward around me for most of the past 2 years with the specific discomfort of men who participated in something by not stopping it, said quietly, "We should have said something. Earlier, both of us." "Yes," I said simply. "But here we are now." He nodded. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, or not all of it yet, but it was the beginning of something honest, which is all beginnings ever are. Theodore called once, months after the settlement. Ethan was the one who told me later that Theodore was living in a condo downtown, that he had lost 2 business partnerships in the fallout from the legal proceedings, that he was quieter than he used to be in the particular way of men who have stopped performing a version of themselves that no longer holds. The call was brief. He asked how I was. I told him I was well. He said he was glad. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "I think about the dogwood trees on Briarwood Lane. I had planted those trees. I had pruned them every February. They had nothing to do with him, except that he had lived beside them for 20 years without once asking who planted them. They're probably blooming right now," I said. "Yeah," he said. "Probably." We didn't have anything else to say that the 31 years between us hadn't already said. After we hung up, I sat for a moment in the office at the back of the garden center. On my desk there was a stack of curriculum outlines for a new workshop series I was developing. Gardening for new retirees, for people starting over, for people who had spent decades taking care of everyone else's growing things and were only now learning to tend their own. On the windowsill was a photograph Josephine had taken at the first workshop. Me at the front of the room, hands in the soil, looking directly at something off camera, laughing. I remember what I was looking at. Ruth had dropped a bag of vermiculite and it had gone everywhere, and it was genuinely very funny. I look at that photograph sometimes and try to trace the distance between the woman at that dinner table, swallowing herself whole so her husband could feel full, and the woman in the photograph with soil on her hands and nothing to perform. The distance is not as large as I expected. She was always there, waiting in the journals and the recipe boxes and the classrooms and the gardens, waiting for the moment someone stopped asking her to be less. Theodore once said that without him, I wouldn't know how to manage a utility bill. What he didn't understand, what I didn't fully understand until I was standing in a greenhouse on the south side of Greenville, learning how to be visible again, is that the women in my family are not built to disappear. We are built to outlast, and no matter how many years you have spent being asked to make yourself smaller, your life still belongs to you. It is never too late to remember that. It is never too late to plant something and watch it grow on your own terms, in your own soil, under your own name.